My name is David Kucharski. I'm the Assistant Planning Director for the town. Thank you all for coming. This is the second housing panel. It's the fifth in a series of 6 panels that we've been holding for the last couple of months, excuse me. We're in the process of scheduling the final panel, which will be the second economic development panel, and we have the date, time, and location. We'll be getting that information out to you. Just some other important dates I'd like to make everyone aware of if you haven't already heard. Tomorrow there'll be a joint Board of Selectmen Planning Board meeting. That'll be taking place tomorrow, 7 p.m. in Estabrook Hall and Cary Hall. That'll be discussing the Hartwell North zoning initiative. On June 4th, there'll be the kickoff for the comprehensive plan, which in essence will end the phase 1 of what we've been involved with and beginning the phase 2 of the comp plan. Again, that's June 4th. That's in Batten Hall at 7 p.m. Just want to acknowledge and thank members of the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee who are here with us this evening, as well as town meeting members. And I also want to note Planning Board member Richard Canales here and Selectman Jill High is here as well. So thank you for coming. As we mentioned in the past, these panels are intended to give a larger regional and statewide perspective. The hope is that we can take that perspective as we move forward with developing the plan for this community. I just want to note that LexMedia is here as well, and will be recording this panel and has recorded all the past panels, and you can go to the comprehensive plan website, www.lexingtoncomplan.com.
LexingtonMA.gov/complan 2 Ps.
COMPPLAN. Thank you, Dave. If you have anything specific to Lexington, we have some blue cards in the back. Please feel free to fill them out, hand them to myself or Mr. Fields in the back who's standing up. With that, I just want to introduce Eric Calverson with RKG. He will be facilitating tonight's panel. He's been helping with logistics and setting up all these events. With that,
great. Thanks so much, David. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Really nice day compared to our holiday weekend, unfortunately. But thanks for taking time tonight to come out to the 5th of 6 panels. After this one, we've got one more to go. It'll be on economic development. We're extremely close to scheduling it for maybe the second week of June or so. But keep your eyes on the comp plan website for that one. Hopefully we'll get confirmation this week and get that one wrapped up. That'll be the last one. So just a quick overview, well, same as all the other ones. If you've been there, I see a couple of familiar faces, about 40 or 45 minutes of discussion, Q&A amongst the panel and myself, and then we'll switch into audience Q&A. So as you're listening, write down questions, think about what you'd like to ask, and we'll do our best to respond. Again, try to keep the comments sort of regional, state, nation, high level. We've got a really great panel I'm going to introduce who I think can literally speak at almost every level of geography from the local all the way up to the national. So I think this should be a really fun discussion tonight. Lexington, housing's certainly a challenge for a lot of different reasons. It's a very desirable community. Why so many people live here and why so many people want to live here. Which ends up driving up the prices of housing, both owner-occupied and rental housing. We pulled some stats. We talked about these at the last housing panel, but I'll talk about them again. Owner-occupied housing comprises about 80% of Lexington stock, and about 84% of that is over $500,000 in terms of the sale price. 27% of value is over $1 million. So if you're trying to get into the owner-occupied market in Lexington, it's going to cost pretty penny. And buildings with 3 or more units only make up about 15% of the town's housing stock. So those multifamily units, which are becoming more and more desirable for both the younger generation, the older generation, and a lot of folks in between, are kind of hard to find here. And when we looked at vacancy, that really, I think, solidified it for us. The vacancy for owner-occupied housing here is 0.3%. The vacancy for rental housing is 2.6%. And typical sort of healthy vacancy rates are 2% for owner-occupied, you're at 0.3, 6% for rental, you're at 2.6. So the housing market is constrained in Lexington, and This is by no means a Lexington issue. It's a Commonwealth-wide issue for the most part. Many, many communities, particularly inside of 128. I'm sure we'll get into some of that tonight. So that just kind of sets the stage a little bit. Hopefully gives our panelists a little bit of fodder. So I'll just start with really quick introductions. So immediately to my left, I have Crystal Cornegay, who's the now Executive Director of Mass Housing. So Crystal became Mass Housing Executive Director in February of 2018, bringing with her extensive experience and expertise in affordable housing, community development, and government. Immediately before joining Mass Housing, Ms. Cornegay served as the Undersecretary of Housing and Community Development for the Commonwealth. Prior to that, she was the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Development Corporation, Urban Edge, and a Project Manager for the Community Builders. Next to Crystal is Chris Herbert, the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Chris has extensive experience conducting research related to housing policy and urban development, both in the U.S. and abroad. A key focus of his research has been on the financial and demographic dimensions of homeownership and the implications for homeownership policy of the recession, housing bust, and foreclosure crisis. Chris has led the team responsible for producing the Center's annual State of the Nation's Housing and its biennial America's Rental Housing Report. He was named the Managing Director of the Joint Center in 2015. Next to Chris is Elizabeth Rust from the Regional Housing Services Office. Liz Rust has over 8 years experience with Massachusetts affordable housing programs and regulations from many aspects and a current focus on the municipal perspective. Liz directs the innovative Regional Housing Services Office, which many of you may have heard of, an intermunicipal collaboration between Acton, Bedford, Burlington, Concord, Lexington, Sudbury, and Weston. The RHSO provides administrative housing services to these towns, assisting them with proactive monitoring, project technical support, and affordable housing expertise. And next to Liz is Chris Clutchman, Housing Choice Program Director for the Department of Housing and Community Development. Chris manages the Baker-Polito Administration's Housing Choice Initiative, which rewards local governments that are producing housing. Prior to this role, she worked for the town of Westford for 7 years as the Director of Land Use Management and Town Planner, where she oversaw high levels of development activity and an increase in staffing in several other controversial projects. Prior to that, she worked in Oregon for the first half of her career, including co-founding a planning firm and working for the Regional Planning Agency. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. If you could take maybe a minute or two-ish and just briefly describe a bit about what you do on a day-to-day basis in your job and sort of your involvement with housing in Massachusetts. Crystal, do you want to start and we'll work our way down?
No, that's why it's unfair for me to sit here because I have to start. What I do day to day. So just so you know, this is like my 91st day on the job. And so a lot of what I do day to day is figuring out the agency. Can I just say that a bunch of my career is thinking about how to expand housing opportunities. And my focus is particularly for working families. And by family, you could be a person of one, but like really trying to make sure that Massachusetts is open and welcoming to working families.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Chris, you made that hard. So I direct the Research Center at Harvard, whose mission is to advance understanding of housing issues and to inform policy. So on a day-to-day basis, what my center is doing is to try to provide a factual basis for informing national, state, local conversations around housing, which relate to housing affordability, access to home ownership, racial and economic integration in communities.
Hi, I'm Liz Rust.
The only Chris, not
I know.
the only
The only
person,
non-Chris,
not
yes.
Chris on that.
That's confusing. Can we call you Chris?
I'm Chris Rust. Right, so that was a nice introduction. Thank you, Eric, and I'm really glad to be here. I've been working with Lexington Housing since 2011. So it's been some number of years, and for Lexington as well as the other 7 communities in our regional consortium, we have an office of a number of staff, and we provide technical assistance, as it said. So we do some monitoring, We work with residents, either current residents or potential new residents. We have a website that lists all the opportunities. We get many, and I mentioned that, we get many calls from people looking for housing in Lexington. And we try our best to point them to appropriate places. We run lotteries in Lexington and assist in the various developers and town boards and committees in expanding housing units, making sure that they are offered in the appropriate manners and compliance with, with all of that part, and work with the Board of Selectmen on their goals relative to housing.
It's hard to follow these guys, really. So working for a state agency, one of the big things, like for an initiative that was just announced in December of 2017, I've been on the road a great deal. I think I've done 35 presentations in the last 4 months. Just talking to all communities all around the state about the Housing Choice Initiative, and I love to talk about housing, and that's a really fun thing. I get to do research about best practices and gather and document best practices and share that information with communities and also regional planning agencies who kind of are umbrellas over local governments. And then I get to collaborate with other state agencies. And I should mention that Crystal Cornegay is one of the authors, really, with her old hat of the DHCD director of the Housing Choice Initiative. And so she really formed this collaborative group of agencies kind of sharing information, whether it was Mass Housing, DHCD, Mass Housing Partnership, there's a whole kind of alphabet soup of agencies, but also Mass Department of Transportation, Mass Department of Revenue, other agencies that are important in the conversation about housing. So that's the other thing I do, is I kind of have a weekly meeting with all sorts of different agencies to talk about where we are in terms of housing.
So, Chris K.
Be careful, we got 2 Chris K's on either end.
That's me.
All right. So just starting with you, you've been doing a lot of traveling around the state over the last couple of months.
Sure.
When you're talking to municipalities, residents, whoever it might be, what do you hear coming out of them or these towns, cities and towns? One of the biggest challenges around housing.
So frankly, I don't know that I hear, I mean, you said it already. You talked about the vacancy rates, the lack of supply. I mean, there really is, it's a fairly simple economic proposition. Massachusetts' housing supply has been constrained over the last 3 decades. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, we were building about 30,000 housing units a year. The 80s, 90s, and aughts, we're down to 15,000 housing units average a year. So that's half. So there's been a constraint on the market, and there's very little inventory that's out there, especially now in a healthy market where people are looking to rent and looking to buy. The market's very constrained, and that means the prices are very high. So lack of inventory and extremely high prices.
Liz, do you want to?
So I think that's absolutely true. Of course, I think that at all price points, probably except for the $1 million and up, like that, maybe that price point's taken care of, but pretty much everything underneath there. So when I say that, I mean even like what people might call a high moderate or a workforce housing, like a 300,000, 400,000 price point even. As well as all the way down to very low income housing, so that there's a need really across the board. So any effort that communities undertake to address any housing in those areas is always well received. And once, it was easier back in the 40B days when developers were building and delivering all of this restricted housing, but as communities hit the 10%, it's just harder. Who's building that, and who's subsidizing that, and how does that get built, really? It's hard for municipalities, and there's a lot of zoning discussions and reform, and I know that that's very active in Lexington. I think that Eric mentioned no, it was David, the North Hartwell zoning community meeting for tomorrow. There was just something that was passed at town meeting, Article 42, right? That was pretty big. It wasn't passed. It wasn't passed. Okay, it was discussed. Sorry, it was discussed, right? So zoning, and zoning's hard. So, so it's one way that towns can encourage private delivery of restricted housing, but it's hard to get consensus on zoning.
So they were all going to say the same thing in one form or another. I think the biggest challenge we're facing in the Commonwealth is similar to what's being faced across the country, which is housing affordability. And these are all components of it. So I would say the issue is that housing prices are growing much faster than incomes. And that's forcing people to spend way too much on rent, which has all kinds of important implications for what they can spend on food, healthcare, savings, transportation, and the like. It also means that young people don't have access to home ownership. That movement into home ownership is delayed, which has implications for growing wealth over the course of a lifetime. What's behind the housing affordability issue? Housing affordability is a relationship between housing costs and income. So part of the conversation, which maybe is your economic development panel, is we need to have better jobs. But if we're here to have a conversation about housing, we have to talk about how we bring the cost of housing down. What goes into the cost of housing? One is land. And that's critically important here in Lexington. So how do we bring the cost of land down? Well, one way is you put more housing on land to try to get more housing out of that land. And that relates to a lot of the zoning issues you're talking about. The other is, what goes into making the house. And so part of that has to do with how big the house is, how full of amenities the house is. And so we have to allow for simpler, smaller housing units as well. And we have to find ways to foster innovations in construction, modular housing, panelized housing, and other needs. So people ask me all the time, what's the solution to housing affordability? Is it this, is that, is the other thing? Yes, it's this, that, and the other thing. We have to work on all of those dimensions in trying to solve that issue.
Do you want to do that?
Now I feel unfair that I'm last. I just can't win. I would say yes to all the things that folks have described. When I go around the Commonwealth, in my previous job, when I went around the Commonwealth, people talk a lot about wanting to make sure that their communities remained sort of what they bought into. And that as a balance with wanting to make sure that their young people in the communities could afford to live there. And so that's where the rub comes in terms of what everybody else is talking about, right? Because if you're producing housing at half the rate as you were 3 decades ago, then supply and demand does play into it, and young people can't afford to do that. I appreciate the conversation around jobs, but with a focus kind of inside 128, like we have young people who are, making $100,000. Who knew that you could be 28 and make $100,000, right? We have young people making $100,000 and not able to afford a house. Like, that's a problem that we all have to confront, including the young people in terms of what their expectation is of what their first house is, and including us in terms of thinking about what we should be building as young people's first house. And so, you know what I mean, in terms of we need small housing, that's true too, but like if you're thinking about, again, a 28-year-old who's making $100,000 working in Google in Boston, right? Like, where are they living and what does their first house look like? And so we also need some creativity around that piece as well.
Eric, if I could just jump in, and it's not only that we have the younger generation, the millennials, but we also have the baby boom. And the baby boomers are getting older, and they have actually sometimes similar housing needs. They want smaller units. Besides Crystal's Google employee, you have reduced income when you're retired, and you might have a smaller income when you're younger and kind of coming up. And so your amount of buying power is a little bit less. But both of those generations want a place where you can walk, to something interesting. They want things to do. They want amenities. They don't necessarily want the big single-family house with the driveway that you're shoveling like a zillion times, like this winter. And so it's not just, there's young people, and then the baby boom is a huge number of people. It's not called baby boom for no reason. And so those folks also have changing housing needs as well.
I want to touch upon something Chris H. mentioned, which was jobs. And then one thing I was thinking of in terms of the cost of producing housing is labor. So land, labor, materials. We're working on a project out in Michigan. Went out there a couple weeks ago. Obviously, Michigan's nothing like Massachusetts housing market. But interestingly, what we learned is that there's actually not trained, skilled people left in Michigan after the recession. They all left because there was nowhere to build, so they went south, and they haven't come back. So one challenge that they're having is actually training people to construct the housing that they need, or to rehab the tens or hundreds of thousands of units that have gone before over time. So I'm wondering, what's the labor market? Do you have a sense of what the labor market is here in Massachusetts and how that may affect the cost of housing? And then my other question around jobs, maybe for other folks on the panel, is as the baby boomers are aging out of the workplace, will Massachusetts remain a competitive market for younger workers if the housing cost continues to rise faster than wages, maybe other than your $100,000+ a year earners? Any thoughts on either of those questions?
I will say that here's the myth. Baby boomers aren't aging out of the workplace. They're working into 70s, 75s. And the challenge that we're having, both in terms of sort of the housing costs, but even from the workplace perspective, is like young people, like they want to move up. You all know your children and your nieces and nephews, right? They go to work for a week and they want to be the boss the next week. And it's sort of like, how are we creating opportunity for them if we're all working until we're 70 and 75? And I will say that part of it has to do with all of us being able to be healthier longer, but also with all of us, like there's an economic security thing. Some of us just have to work longer, and how are we thinking about that balance in terms of the workforce and jobs and what that means for young people. And so we've all got to think differently about one of the I'm from New York, and so one of the challenges, which is just a bigger place, right? And so it's just bigger. And one of the challenges you have in New England is this, not just here, but all across New England, wanting to sort of hold on to the character of neighborhoods, back, hundreds of years ago. And so, and I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying that those neighborhoods weren't the same as they were like hundreds of years before that, right? And so we need to be thinking about what our neighborhoods, our communities look like 100 years from now, and how we hold on to our history. But there's some of it in which we gotta look to our future. And so, and we gotta be willing to do that. And that's hard, right? Like, it's like, that means that I have to be different. Like, I don't want to be different. I love change, but as long as you're changing, it's all good. And so we got to be able to, as a community, if we want to be able to thrive for the long term, be thinking about what that community looks like over time, and where are the places in which we can have denser housing, multifamily housing, all different kinds of things. Where are the places we can be thinking about smaller lot sizes, in which we're doing, accessory dwelling units or whatever. We've got to be thinking about that, or we're going to find ourselves awake in our, 2,000 square foot houses alone because our kids are going to be moving to Arizona because that's where they can afford a house.
All right, I don't know how to follow that.
Don't move to Arizona.
Going back to some of the things you raised too, Eric, I'm not a labor market person. I do know that we're involved with national businesses in the housing sector, and this issue of labor shortages everywhere. And it's ironic, right, that we're talking about the fact that we need to create better jobs, and yet construction companies and manufacturers in a lot of parts of the country are going looking for those jobs. So there's a mismatch of who needs the jobs and where they are. And that plays out in space too, right? So in terms of where people live and where the people who don't have jobs and where the jobs are. So I think part of the conversation too is around we need to have opportunities to live in lots of diverse places, people with different income levels, education levels, in order to be able to have the workers who are going to fill those jobs. And think about the aging baby boomers, major job growth category is going to be healthcare service people for helping us get out of our chairs and feed ourselves and all those things. Where are they going to come from? Where are they going to live, right? So, you're talking about the community and the community of the future. We also have to picture ourselves in the future, right? Where we're going to be and how, the idea of getting older and where I want to live. And so trying to support the kinds of housing that will be both beneficial for yourself and for the people who are going to support you as you age. That's to be part of the story.
I would just add that there's certainly major businesses in the Commonwealth, especially kind of Worcester County and East, that have stepped forward and said housing is a crisis for them. They have, whether it's Boston Medical Center or iRobot or whoever it is, they are facing the high housing costs in Massachusetts is impacting their ability to retain workers, because their workers need to make more and more money, or even to attract new workers. And so they have really kind of stepped forward and said this is an important issue for economic development, and it's a significant issue for the Commonwealth. Hence, the Governor's Housing Choice Initiative is one way to try and address that. On the South Shore Chamber of Commerce, Chambers of Commerce are not known for their outlandish like social policies. They have put forward housing as their #1 issue. And in fact, again, chambers tend to go away from controversial issues. As we know, housing can be very controversial at the local level, yet they have said, their board said, this is so important, we're going to put it forward. We think our communities need to build more housing, and this is an issue for us. So they're definitely, the business groups and business associations are stepping forward to really make it very clear that our economy cannot continue to thrive if we don't do something to change the housing prices in particular.
I like the comment about thinking maybe not 100 years into the future, but at least some number of years into the future that people can grab onto and say, yeah, I can picture that. And we're working on a project out in a community in Metro West. One thing, we do a lot of work out there, and one thing I always hear about is the reverse commuting. It can't, there's actually a number of tech companies and pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers out there, but the younger workers don't want to live in here, so how do we get them out there? They don't want to drive. And so we said, well, what if you took a couple areas in your community where you already have, say, mostly commercial, but there's a ton of surface parking lots, give them the density to then build like little mini neighborhoods that have the amenities that people who are living in Cambridge or Somerville or Boston might want, but at a cheaper housing cost. They thought that was a great idea. The employers thought it was a great idea. But then when you go and talk to the community, they have the same vision that they want workers to be able to get there and their economy to thrive. But it's like when you touch on the idea of development and housing, it's like this, it's a third rail. It's seen every community I go to almost. How do we get, what do you think are some solutions, or maybe some communities who are doing well that maybe Lexington could look to as potential examples, or who's doing it well? Who's furthering the conversation?
I'm looking at Chris, because we're going to probably come up with the same examples from our housing choice section.
Yeah,
I'll let you go first.
Alrighty, so the Housing Choice Initiative, just very briefly, looks to reward communities that have built housing in the last 5 years. And so we just went through a process to identify those, set this criteria, and have communities apply. If you have a handout that looks kind of like this, we were amazed to see there were 67 communities that achieved housing choice status. Those are communities that that increased their housing stock by 5% or 500 units, or 3% 300 units, and a bunch of best practices, which mostly have to do with zoning and having good zoning. The good zoning sets the table, right? But it doesn't necessarily produce units. You have to actually produce units. So we have these 67 communities. And if you pick this up, it has a map of where they are, and then it profiles 11 different communities. So you can see for yourself, but there are communities that are, again, every community in Massachusetts is unique and special. I learned that when I moved here from Oregon. In my first job interview, I tried to say that one community was like another, and I did get asked back for a second job interview, but I had to kind of absolutely retract what I had said. But Reading has done a really good job. They're a 128 community. They have there is a section in the state law called 40R districts. Chapter 40, so that's our Mass General laws. All have numbers. Chapter 40A is the Zoning Act. But Chapter 40R allows for increased densities in the right location, near transit, near activity nodes, and it gives incentives for communities to do that by having state provide funding if you do the zoning, and then more funding if you build the housing units. So Reading is a great example of a community, a suburban community that has embraced that and done, I think it's 2 different 40R districts, but kind of in their downtown. So Lexington Center would be an example of the kind of location where you have 2 different bus routes going through there. You've got the bike trail. That's an area of, an activity area where you've got, and rooftops will help the retailers there. So Reading's what comes to mind. The city of Beverly, again, a little different from Lexington, has also done some really interesting and innovative things, and really their community and their political leadership has embraced the need to expand the housing choices that they have, whether it's artist lofts. I think they have some very small apartments, going kind of micro units, and other measures. Crystal, what were you thinking?
Littleton.
Okay.
Littleton, which when I heard the town manager of Littleton talk about much of what I did in my previous job and a little bit in this job is talking to communities like yours about 40B, which 40B actually is mostly not contentious, but because of the way media works, all you hear about is the contentious stuff. And because of the way the market is in Massachusetts, and we haven't been building for a long time, developers are, you hear a lot more about 40B developments than you have heard in the past. Littleton has taken the stance that they're above 10%, and they've taken the stance of the way that they manage 40B kind of development that might not fit into what they see as their future, is to remain above 10%. And so they see housing development as a way to actually kind of stave off sort of unfriendly 40Bs, because that's the way that they're going to remain above 10%, because you all know that 10% is not a static kind of thing. And so so I think about Littleton as a way of how do we stay ahead of this? How do we keep thinking about how we grow our housing stock, affordable or not, in terms of a balance, so that we can sort of control our own kind of destiny around this stuff, in addition to the things that Chris described.
I feel like with 40B and other programs, I hear a lot about housing at the kind of 80% level, but not as much 50 or 30 or even below. Liz, I'm wondering if you, from your work, if you have any sense of, are there programs or partnerships or developers out there who are trying to target low income or extremely low AMI thresholds, and are they being successful, particularly in the suburban locations?
Most of the housing that gets permitted outside of Boston gets permitted under 40B. And so from DHCD's purge, from Mass Housing's purge, most of the projects we see are permitted under 40B, which is why I know that there are many 40Bs that don't end up in the paper or as contentious, because we fund them. And there are many 40Bs that aren't contentious, that are 100% affordable at different kinds of tiers using affordable resources. And so much of what you hear about is, some developer wants to plop down some 300 unit development, sort of in this part of town, in which, on some level, even, those of us who think about this stuff don't think it's the right place. But, we got rules and regs that we have to follow. And so part of what we're trying to do in mass housing in particular is to help communities figure out how to use 40B to their advantage, as opposed to making it this whole contentious thing. Because many communities are like, I assume all of you are here tonight at 7 o'clock, 7:45, on a Tuesday night after Memorial Day because you care about this issue, right? And many communities do, and you want to figure out what is sort of the right thing for your community in terms of contributing to housing production across the Commonwealth. And so many communities do. It becomes a contentious issue. You know, like you're in a supermarket, you're arguing with your neighbor about this thing, like it's like, it becomes like a life-changing kind of issue. And I sort of commend people who want to take this on because, you know, it is a huge, big deal. And it requires a lot of change and a lot of flexibility, and but it's something that we all have to actually do. And we've got to figure out where's the place in your community where you're, you know, willing to give that thing up. You're talking about downtowns and 40Rs, Lexington Center. We're seeing a lot of folks in their kind of downtown communities thinking about, okay, that's the right place for density, how much density, what does that look like, because to get at the supply problem isn't just increasing supply, it's you got to do it at a pace that matters. And so 15,000 units a year sounds like a lot, but if we're really supposed to be doing 25, then, you know, that makes a difference. And so we've got to be thinking about that as well.
Liz, do you want to add kind of from the
I've been
regional
rambling,
perspective?
So
sorry.
I think you asked about the affordability level, and I think that Crystal is right, like most things get permitted under 40B, and we see some deeper affordabilities under the 40B program, but mostly those are age-restricted housing that's going for state subsidies in the communities that I see. And then it's really, you know, it requires so much assistance that you really are in for the long haul. Like these are 5, 6, maybe 7-year projects versus the private 40B that once you permit it, you finance it, you're closing right away, and it's a much shorter time frame. We don't see as much family, very low income family housing. Period. Right. We just were working on a project in Bedford that was preserving an expiring use, 96 unit project. And in the preservation, they were able to restrict at lower levels all of the units, including some of the family units at different affordability levels. So that was, you know, but those are specific opportunities that come along because of a particular property or a particular, you know, situation.
No, this one, do people here speak AMI? So he's throwing out like that 30 AMI, 50
Okay,
AMI,
good.
there's a
Thank you.
certain level of housing subsidy speak. So we're talking about, in housing terms, we talk about area median income. So what's the typical household make? And then subsidy programs are aimed at different brackets of that. So the lowest one that we talk about is 30% of area median income, which is generally what you think about of people living in poverty. And so you talk about how much it should go to people making poverty. 50% of AMI is generally about people who are working year-round at like a $14 an hour job. And then so you move up, 80% of AMI might be what the teachers and the firemen make, right? And so 100% of AMI is probably a Google worker around here. And so we think about who do we want to help? And I think it also then relates back to where you are, right? And so and how much is it going to cost to help those households? So if you're going to help a family who's in poverty to afford a house in Lexington, that's a lot of subsidy, right? And then the question is, you know, is that the best way to spend that money? And there's a bit of a philosophical debate, right? Because Lexington ought to have people of all income levels. On the other hand, if you can help them in Waltham, you can help 2 of them, maybe that's better. So there's a bit of that conversation around how do we make the most of our scarce $70 dollars. The other thing I would say is it becomes this kind of Solomon-like choice, like who are we going to help, right? Because we don't have enough money to help everybody. And again, going back to one thing Crystal said, one thing I would say is what we ought to do when we do these programs, whenever we spend our money, is think about how do we make it last for as long as possible. And so there's often a tendency to say, oh, this will be assisted for 10 years. And now I think that you look at the 10 years and suddenly those are expiring. oh, we lost those units, what do we do now? So, I think in a town like Lexington, one thing to think more about is how do we think about entry-level homeownership opportunities? Because there are a lot of, it's 80% owner-occupied in the town, there are a lot of people who would like to get a footing in this town. And one of the things I'll make a plug for people at Mass Housing, people at DHCD, is there's not a lot of subsidy dollars for long-term restricted, deed-restricted affordable homeownership. And thinking about, can you get, with $100,000, you can help a family get into homeownership. We go into the technicalities of this, but ways you can do that and say that $100,000 becomes a stake in that property. We're going to make sure it's always affordable to somebody making 80% of the area median income. You get some appreciation, but some of that stays with that unit you sell to somebody. I think Muzzy condominiums are that in town. I think there's another affordable housing development that's like that. I think that's a kind of, thinking about a spectrum of who you want to help, what fits with Lexington, and how do you make sure that it lasts for a long time. So I would just make a plea to think about your seat at Mass Housing.
No. I think about, actually, it's one of the things I think about a lot because I think Mass Housing has begun being a leader in this conversation around workforce housing. And I feel really strongly that if you're a household that's making $100,000, you should be able to buy a house, right? It's crazy that we're thinking about how to subsidize rental units for some household that's making $100,000. And I think that that's a great idea when you all are thinking about homeownership opportunities. God bless you. Homeownership opportunities, but think about the spectrum of what that might look like, right? So it's not just sort of duplicating what your home looks like, right? It's thinking about smaller opportunities. It's thinking about if you're, a young family who, can afford a homeownership opportunity, and maybe it's like a 1-bedroom with a den or something where you're growing into, and it's a condo. It's stretch yourself into thinking about what that looks like, as opposed to what we all want to do is recreate our own lifestyle, right? And so we've got to be thinking differently about what that lifestyle is at. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about that.
Okay.
And where that might go and how we might finance that. Because it's not just, as Chris says, it's not just that young family. It's when I'm looking to downsize, right? I'm looking to downsize and, maybe I don't want a micro unit, but it'd be great not to have, 1,500 square feet. Maybe I'm okay in 1,000. And so, and I got a little money and I can afford that. And I need 2 bedrooms because, I need the healthcare worker to kind of be able to spend a night because my kid can't take care of me. And so, what does that look like? And we got to be thinking about those lifestyle choices and how that's really different than maybe the way we think about our own lives and how we live those lives.
So we're at 10 at 8. This would be a good chance to go to audience Q&A. Anybody have any questions? Start here.
Two things, I'll try to be succinct. Is that a question of the available housing stock, or is it a question of the demand, what you were talking about the variety of available housing stock? Because those units in Lexington are disappearing faster than you can shake a stick at it, because the over $1 million units sell faster, or they sell for more, and as a private owner, to get that. So I'm not sure, I guess my question is, what are some municipalities doing to try and achieve that diversity? And my second question is, I don't think housing happens in a bubble, because the chickens come before the egg in terms of schools and housing for families, and the ability to manage the balance there, because we already have overcrowded schools. How do we manage the balance as we increase, if we are able to increase our housing stock?
I'll take the easy one, the easier one, and I'll leave leave the schools for a second. So Lexington, 4 years ago, did a housing production plan, and this is a really detailed analysis, and I know your staff will be, this will be one of the starting points in the comprehensive plan, because it's data that was done. Again, it's 4 years old now, and not sure of the timing of the comprehensive plan, if you'll be able to use the 2020 census. But this identifies like kind of what the gaps are, like who's here, who's not here. And I think that my memory of looking at this data in the past is that Lexington really lacks that young family demographic. People move here with kids that are a little older because it takes so much capital to come in, or they're just moving in if they are wealthy. But there is this kind of missing demographic from Lexington, those younger families, and kind of more the workforce housing. So, no, I mean, I'm not saying there aren't children that are coming in. I'm just saying that that is kind of a missing demographic, or at least was in the analysis. And the other thing I would say is that what the housing production plan says is it's not just housing for people who aren't here yet. There were 3,500 people, at the poverty level in the 2014 housing production plan. So these are our residents. These are us. These are Lexingtonians, and they need housing. And if you want to downsize and you want to stay in Lexington, it's very, very difficult, because not only are the housing type not there, but what you can afford is not there. And so again, thinking about how does Lexington want to be, and how does it accommodate the people who are here now, in addition to people who may be missing. So that's my 2 cents on the first part.
That desirable to the current homeowners. Well, sure. Have to somehow make.
Well, what I would say of best practices, I mean, the private market will not solely solve this. So the practices that the town can do, one of the best things the town can do is use town-owned land. And either deeply discount or provide, or donate town-owned land. Put out an RFP to dispose of surplus land and say, what we would like here is affordability at X percentage or at X density, and bring in a developer to come and do that. That is one of the things in terms of best practices. That is certainly something that communities around the state are doing, and is a great way to actually get at the cost of building the housing. Because if you take away or deeply discount that land value, that's a big help.
Zoning certainly matters, right? So from that same plan, 90% of Lexington is zoned for single family, 2% zoned for two family, and 3% is areas where you can do higher density with special permits. But so there's not a lot of land to do any variations except for the McMansion, right? So you have to allow for higher density housing in more areas of town if you're going to get a diversity.
Nothing on the schools.
Sorry. No, it's okay. Most of, maybe not in Lexington, I don't have the data. Most school districts across the Commonwealth are decreasing in their, it's okay, it's not Lexington, I'm just telling you, like Commonwealth-wide, that's the case. Much of where children come from, school-age children come from, is the sale of the McMansion. Right? It's not this new production thing. It's somebody who's, they got a little money. They want to come so they can go to school with your kids, right? And so that's where we've seen across the Commonwealth where young people come from. So it's not the sort of new production of housing, it's the resale of existing housing that we're seeing young people come from.
And in fact, that's true in Lexington, because there really hasn't been a huge increase in housing units.
Production, right.
But the school enrollment is kind of through the roof. So it doesn't relate to the new units.
I'd like some more information on the reason why the production fell in half. The way I look at these things, we've got to better understand what the driving factors were on the decrease before you can start analyzing how do you get better. Because it isn't just the locality that's affecting it, it's whatever the parameters are. So I haven't heard any statistics yet as to whether it was the availability of jobs that you touched on, or whether it was material costs, or whatever it might have been that caused that drop. So I think to know you got the problem, you've got to know why it was the problem. And so I think I'd like to see that. Paired with that is the fact that I'm a little bit put off by finding success stories when you haven't varied your data source, in that a success story in a rural community or a semi-rural community is a totally different problem than as you've just been addressing with Lexington, where we do not have town land that we can offer as a component. We have to go out and compete on the market to find land, whether it's a tear down or something we're going to rehab. So I would just suggest for us to better understand how for each of our communities, whatever they might be, not just Lexington, we need to know better what is driving the production decline and know whether there is something viable in something to do in that degree. Whether it's sponsoring education, whether it's in our regular schools or our technical schools, to produce the labor force that's needed for something other than where the demand is being limited by a small quantity, and therefore the prices, whether it's unions or otherwise, goes up very high. And then secondly, as I said, you've got to segregate the communities of the Commonwealth to learn what the primary factors are in their makeup that affect what they could do. Because having the will to do something is something we all hope we have to try to address this problem. But each community exists with parameters that constrain and preclude and avoid, and all those other verbs, the ability to use the tools that another community can use. So it doesn't particularly help if there are success stories unless you say, now in the Commonwealth, we've got another 20 communities that are somewhat comparable in these parameters, whatever they may be, that define the ability to produce accept housing. And focus on matching success for that kind of a community for success on a peer community to it. And then find what the mechanisms are, after understanding what cut down the production, what are the mechanisms that are applicable to another set of our communities, which Lexington, I would say, from what you described, is clearly different from many of our other communities. So I'll stop there, but that's what I'm looking for some help, as I'm a quantitative person, and applying averages across this problem. I don't want to be too blunt, but I think it's useless.
So I'm happy to try and get at that. So one of the main things that happened is downzoning. So neighborhoods that were allowed to be built historically at much smaller lot sizes.
Can I just do one more thing before you get into details? Let me just do one setup thing. So when we started this Housing Choice Initiative, the governor asked that very question. And so we spent months interdisciplinary. We had EEA, we had environmental, we had DOR, we had A&F, we had folks from planning, the various housing agencies, just looking at data to try to put this stuff together. And how we came up with this was thinking about this thing that you're describing. So I just want to set that up for you. Sorry, Chris.
Okay, I hope I do it justice. So downzoning, so taking, so again, just to real quick on zoning, you have, for residential, certain lot sizes that allows you to build at certain densities or certain intensities. What happened across the Commonwealth is communities said, okay, we kind of like things how it is, and we don't really want more growth, or we don't want them, or whatever it was, and applied zoning that is more restrictive in terms of whether you could redevelop or split one lot in half and get another housing unit. And that has happened, frankly, across much of the Commonwealth. Certainly on the, again, I'm going to say Worcester and East, well, Worcester County and East, when I talk in particular about the housing crisis. Lexington has one of those neighborhoods. I live in Lexington, for those of you who don't know. I live in one of those neighborhoods. That neighborhood near Lexington Center was built with 8,000 square foot lots. Let's ask the planners in the room, can you do 8,000 square foot lots in Lexington anymore? No. The answer is no. It's it's a high priced neighborhood. It's extremely popular. When a house comes on the market, it sells like that in these undersized lots. When Lexington looked to replicate similar neighborhoods to that, it was turned down by town meeting as too dense. And so we got Lexington Gardens, which is, the mega McMansions. So this kind of change in character is zoning is one of the things that happen. And then to unwind that, zoning is very complicated, and people's tendency to not want to accept a change, especially towards more intensity, it's very easy to say no at town meeting. If you don't understand something or you're not really sure you understand the implications. So it's not a fault of town meeting, it's that it is very complicated. So that's in answer to your first question. What led to the decrease in production? I would say downzoning. I don't know if anybody else has other.
Or build out as well. I mean, that's also, I think that over the 80s, 70s and 80s and 90s, the communities in Metro West really were developed in all the, things like cul-de-sacs, but what's the real word? Cluster developments, and there was a lot of buildings, so the land availability really decreased.
There was also an uptick over time in terms of environmental uses. People wanting to sort of have a different level of tolerance for sort of septic and different kinds of things. And so we haven't done a lot of changes related to how those things work, even though the science of that has changed drastically over the past 2 decades.
So, here.
I was just going to add, as far as factors, there were crazy interest rates. If you look at the, double-digit interest rates, there were also housing, one of my mentors, Sam Bass-Warner, people used to invest in housing as an instrument, and people who were thinking about investing in housing thought about investing in other things. So when you look at the housing market, you really need to view it globally as far as where people put the money, what bank, and then also the bank cannibalization. We lost a lot of local banks, they were bought by bigger banks, there wasn't as much community involvement in investment. And those are some of the other things.
I'm going to say, I can't really think of too many things that Lexington has done right to make housing reasonable. We have a downtown where almost all buildings are a single story. And those that have a second story might have a professional office in them or two. I happen to go to graduate school in a town where the main street had 3- and 4-story buildings. First floor was retail, second floor was offices, third and fourth floor were apartments. We don't have that. We have minimum lot size instead of maximum lot size. You should be allowed to build on more than 8,000 square feet. That's plenty. And if you own, as many people in my neighborhood do, 2 lots from the original layout of the town, you can't subdivide them. It's illegal. So we've made the kinds of places that some of us actually think are quite wonderful, like Back Bay, South End, Beacon Hill. They're illegal. Can't have them. I mean, which is just BS. I mean, bottom line is, you're sort of asking for more intrusion by people who can take advantage of 40B because you've outlawed all the other possibly reasonable, potentially more wonderful ways of doing it. I think Reading's a terrible example because what I've seen in Reading are these giant apartment buildings that you can see from the highway. Those aren't in the center of Reading. I don't know how people get to and from them, but I can imagine the traffic must be tremendously difficult. The Anderson Transportation Center is not even connected to those places, even though it's there. So, there are solutions to the problem. We probably don't have the political will to adopt them. And I look at Arlington, and they did a development right along Mass Ave at Mill Street. Charming little buildings and pretty dense. I don't think it's made a huge difference in the town, and yet there's probably 25 or 30 units there. Pretty nice. We could do that right behind CVS, but we won't.
So can I ask you, I see a lot of heads shaking in agreement with you, and so then why are you all here? Well, that's what I'm telling you. My dad used to say, don't shake your head, answer me, I can't hear the rocks in your head jingle. And so then why are you all here? Right? Clearly you all are invested in this. It's like the change isn't gonna happen if you all,
We're a minority.
you're the minority. Yeah, but the governor always says, like, one of the great things about Massachusetts is the ability for a minority, a small group of people to make a huge difference, so.
So I would suggest it's also lack of understanding. And, and I think that it's,
Fear, she said.
I frankly think it's our job to, and that's why I'm here, is to understand better. I've certainly made mistakes in judgment that I've regretted. There's one in particular I know in our neighborhood, which is smaller than 8,000 square foot lots, and very small houses, and thinking that you were protecting the neighborhood and not understanding the longer term implication of that protection. So not wanting someone to subdivide to the original 2 lots, not wanting 2 houses because, oh no, we don't want 2 big houses there, when what was built there, such a big house that it totally was excited in the neighborhood. So you know, and that was my own lack of understanding, and I should have known better, or should have done more research, but, you know, it wasn't me alone, and so I do think it's up to us to come to these events, to hear people who have a lot more experience in housing than I do, and to be able to hear each other speak and know that other people feel, have similar opinions or different opinions that might be valid.
I want to represent that you put out, you know, who's here and why are we here? Great question. But who's not here, right? How many people are under 30 here? Yeah, me too, right. And, yeah. So one of them, I mean, who are we doing this for? I mean, it's, you know, I'll be aging out of this place pretty soon, right? And it's really hard to get them here because they're busy and they're dealing with difficult lives. But their whole view on housing and transportation and everything, I work at MIT. I work with young people all the time, and they have a completely different mindset from homes like what we do. I mean, they want to live in Central Square in an apartment, and they want to be a walk away from 73 different places they can eat, and they have a job, and they make do with what they got. And the trade-offs are not something I would want to do. I did when I was younger, but not now, okay? But if we're building an environment that we want to draw them here, the gentleman that said having some buildings where there's the apartment on the top floor, they love it. I mean, they actually love that. They don't really want to be in the giant apartment building. They don't want to be in, you know, like, you know, 8 acres of whatever. They want to be close, and they want to, many of my students don't have driver's licenses. They're 20 years old, 22 years old, and they don't have driver's licenses. And we go, what? But the current demographics there are very different from when I was growing up. And I'll let you know, it's very difficult to get them in the room to have a discussion about this. I understand that, but if you don't do that, that's, you know, you're not bringing in the client into the discussion. Anyway, that was my point.
You go to the you need to go to the t-ball fields and the soccer fields at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning and talk to people.
But also to also think about the idea that like we're not all created equally, and so there are some young people who do want to live in the apartment in Central Square, and there are some young people who would love to live on the 3rd floor in Lexington Center if there was the opportunity for that. And so yeah, understanding that's such a great point. Thank you for sharing.
So I'm glad to say that I love your idea of picturing the future, and you know, I work very locally, and so I work, like, my life is like boards and committees and night meetings, right? Like that's what I do, you know? And everyone's old. So I'm with you on that. So when you think about the future, like, who's running your town? These towns take a huge amount of volunteers to run the planning boards, the zoning boards, the select boards, and that's what makes your town vibrant and offering the programs. Lexington's very fortunate to have the Community Preservation Act, And using those funds wisely makes a huge difference in preserving open space and your historic resources. And that just takes people putting in that volunteer time, which is also, so as you envision, I know it's just like a small thing, but that's how these towns work. And to attract young people who want to be in your community, to put in the time to continue to invest in the community. You have a great asset in your schools, and I know you want to hide it, and you don't want anyone to go there who's not there already, right? You know, but it's an attraction for people to come to the town, and if people could come and go to school and then have some place to live, you know, you have a vibrancy that will continue in generations to come.
I think we've got time for one or two. Otherwise, I think there are blue cards. At least there were at the previous panel, so you can jot your questions down and give them to one of the two Davids in the back. But I'll go to the orange shirt.
Okay. I am an advocate of the Fair Share Amendment, which if it succeeds would increase revenue for schools and for transportation. And I would like to know, and I'm interested in that because although my kids both went through the Lexington schools, and I think that was a very positive experience, I have no interest in a greedy association with education. I think it ought to be widespread. So if we can pass an amendment such as that, would that have an effect on the real estate prices and the availability, you know, the increased funding for affordable housing in Lexington and across the state? Do you have any comment about that?
What is
The Fair Share Amendment is the millionaire.
It's called the Millionaire Tax.
the ballot.
I'm trying to get it on, well, it will be on the ballot, but it would be
Thank you.
an additional 4% tax on income above $1 million.
Yeah.
And it's reputed to potentially earn around $2 billion for the state. Hopefully we don't rescind the sales tax, which would be away of that. But anyway, and that amount of money would be divided between transportation and education. And I'm very interested in getting education improved in gateway cities like Fall River and Hadley and so forth, so that the demand for, you know, like the intense college prep education you get here in Lexington might be a little distributed around the state. Do you have any comment about that? No.
I'm not familiar with it enough to say, but if I could take the opportunity to mention another piece of legislation that's not a ballot initiative, and which is as part of the Housing Choice Initiative, the governor put forward legislation called an Act to Promote Housing Choices. And what it would do, we've talked about zoning a lot here and the difficulties in adopting zoning. And it would, folks here who are familiar with town meeting know that to change zoning, it takes a 2/3 majority, called a supermajority. Massachusetts is the only state in New England that does that, and is only one of 10 in the country that has that kind of permission needed to change zoning. So this would change the majority to pass zoning amendments to 51%, a simple majority, but only for amendments that would produce more housing. So only for amendments, for example, if you took my neighborhood and made it 8,000 square foot lots, like, so that's increasing the density, that would be an amendment that would qualify under this. So that's, for those of you in touch with your legislators, it's House 4290. I think the piece of paper the summary that I had has a brief summary of it. And I'm happy to talk to anybody else who's interested about it. But so I'm sorry I can't comment on the initiative. I'm just not familiar enough with it.
Is anybody else familiar with that? No?
I would say, I'm not familiar enough with it. What I would say the complicating factor is going to be sort of the school allocation formula.
Yes. Foundation.
And so, yes, the foundation budget. And so it's great that we're going to have more money, but in order to, I'm making this up, in order to get at this thing that you described,
are you gonna be okay that Lexington doesn't actually get more money, but Lawrence does?
Yes.
Right? And so, okay. But again, there's like 20 of y'all.
A lot of people say no to that.
You know, and I'm just like, in order to get at what you're talking about, it's great that the pie is larger, but in order to get at what you're describing, your piece of that larger pie is actually going to be smaller,
Yes.
That's okay.
or the same as what it
We
is.
already got 33% of our school paid for when there's people in other counties towns that have nothing.
Yes,
So
that's awesome.
no, it isn't.
No,
We need to spread the,
We're not
we
diminishing
don't
someone
need to be a
else's
gated
improvement.
community anymore.
No, this town.
That's great.
I don't
One thing
want
I would link it to though is to add an alphabet soup. So there's 40B, 40R, and 40S.
Awesome.
And so related to the schools conversation, if you do 40R and you increase an as of right higher density transit or area, if then that housing gets produced and is not producing enough tax revenue to then pay for the schools at the rate it should, the state through 40S can help subsidize the cost of educating those kids. It's a program that's not very well funded, and so there's not a lot of confidence in it, but if something like this could be tied to bring the conversation of education back to housing is if we can provide funding, says if you allow for higher density, lower cost housing in a community, you're not going to pay the price of having your school budget explode in a way you can't afford. So if we can take that money and tie it to supporting higher density housing and supporting students coming out of that, then we can start to bring these problems together.
And so I think this Hartwell North, I think that you're looking at 40R as part of this project. At least I saw that on the website as I was prepping for this afternoon, and I know that there's that community meeting tomorrow. So maybe that's something to look at, increased commercial revenue as well as the 40R, 40S.
And just to, Mr. Cantor asked for data. There are some studies that are underway that I believe will be finished in the fall that look at the fiscal impact of new residential development. It's across the Commonwealth. I think it's a selection of, they're looking at actual data from, I think, 63 different communities, and they're putting that together. That's being done by Mass Housing Partnership, which is one of the quasi-public agencies that is a funder and a policy leader in housing. So stay tuned, because I think you would like that report, and that's, I mean, this is a common thing that comes up, which is, can somebody please give us some data that says, does increased housing increase the costs to the town, or does it actually give us more revenue than it costs to service it? So there is some work being done by professional economists right now.
Okay, it's 8:20, and everyone here is a volunteer, so I don't want to hold them too much longer, and I do want to say thank you to all of you. This has been great. So we got one more coming up, so stay tuned. Keep checking the website for that one, and thanks everyone for coming.